In many of my Warframe guides, I use Harrow in the background gameplay, and many of you asked me to make an updated 2026 Harrow build. So you know what? I made 5. That's right, in this video you're gonna get the full Harrow broadside, how he works, why he's so ridiculously busted, which builds work best on him, and why one of them is literally broken and way too strong. Big shoutouts to all our generous channel members, and now let's jump right into it. First of all though, it's been quite a while since I last talked about Harrow, so let's do a quick recap on what the man can even do. His passive is easy to explain but incredibly convenient. On the one hand, he has a 200% overshields capacity. This is pretty cool because he is very good at refilling shields quickly. And secondly, and in my opinion more importantly, Harrow has an innate preparation mod. Whichever mission you start, you always start out with 100% of your maximum energy filled. This is incredibly good because it means you don't have to use preparation in your Excel slot, or you just save a format. Ability number 1 goes by the name Condemn, and while this is definitely not one of the best abilities in the entire game, I would still say this one is often underrated. What you do here is actually pretty simple. When you cast the ability, you shoot out a forward carpet of chains. This carpet is 2.5 meters wide by default, and with increased ability range, it not only extends out for longer, but it also becomes thicker so you can hit more enemies at once. Now, why would you want to hit enemies with it? Well, there are 2 reasons. First of all, every enemy hit by this will be chained to the ground and fully frozen. This is a great crowd control tool because the enemies are stunned in a posture where it is super easy to hit their heads. And it's not just normal enemies, also these pesky acolytes that like to get on our nerves in Steel Path, you can also stun them with it. However, what makes the ability even better is that for every chained enemy, you will regenerate a bunch of shield points, transitioning also into overshields. This, by the way, is the reason why the increased overshield capacity from our passive is so nice on Harrow. Especially in very high levels, there's hardly any other ability that makes shield gating so easy and seamless. Bonus points, by the way, because this is Harrow's Helminth ability, so you can literally put it on any other Warframe if you like. There's also an augment called Tribunal, but because this has to do with the effects of the next 2 abilities, I want to talk about it once we're done with those. Skill number 2 is called Penance, and this one is a crazy buff. It does so many things. First of all, when you cast it, you sacrifice all the shields that you currently have, base shields as well as overshields. You're just gonna go down to 0 shields. At the same time, you will gain 50% of the shields that you've sacrificed as healing to your health. This though is just a side fact and not the main reason why you would use the ability. The main reason is all the other buffs. First of all, you will gain melee attack speed as well as weapon fire rate and reload speed. All of these scale with ability strength. At the same time, while this ability is on, you will gain a 5% lifesteal of all the damage that you're dealing. And not just you, this healing extends to all allies in affinity range. Very important here, we're talking about affinity range, which is a set 50 meters. This cannot be modified with any ability range mods. However, if 50 meters is not enough, you could use the Phosphor consumable, which I think extends it outwards to 200 meters. And there's also the Mending Unity perk from the Vazarin's Focus School, which gives you a little bit more on top. Overall though, a base 50 meter range should be enough for most situations. By the way, the duration of Penance also scales with how much shields you have sacrificed. And the cool thing is, you can recast it to further increase the duration to pretty high amounts. And what's more, if you recast it before it ends, then this recast will use the ability strength that you had on the initial cast, regardless of what your current ability strength actually looks like. So yeah, if you like, there is definitely potential for snapshotting. Ability number 3 is called Thurible, and this is the craziest energy generator in the game. If you're Proteus Dispensary, then this is the ability she tells you not to worry about. When you cast Thurible, you will start sacrificing your energy while you see a little number on screen tick up. This process either ends when you're down to 0 energy, or you can just press the ability button again to cancel it prematurely. This number on screen then is the energy that you're going to regenerate for every enemy that you take out. And if you take them out with a headshot, or a shot to their weak point, wherever that may be, then you're even going to get 4 times that. So yeah, you can see how that gets pretty ridiculous pretty quickly. However, also here, the energy gain is not exclusive to Harrow himself, but also it goes for all the allies that are in the little AoE around you that you can see here. Overall, Thurible is an amazing energy regeneration tool. However, as great as it is for solo players, there are a couple of issues if you take this into multiplayer. Given the fact that allies only get their energy refilled by you if they are in the AoE of this skill, that means in a lot of situations the team will just not benefit because it's not worth it to mod 250% range onto Harrow just to help your allies a bit. Thurible also has an augment called Warding Thurible, and I'm gonna be real, this one, I'm not the biggest fan of it. What this does is, while you charge the skill up, allies that are in the AoE around you will take 50% less damage, and whenever they're hit during this charge animation, it will gain you additional energy charge. Given the relatively quick charge time, plus the aforementioned issue with the ability range, I think this augment will hardly ever apply outside of pre-made squad situations where you tell the people to come close to you and yada yada yada, but in all other cases, I just absolutely don't see this. And now that we're covered Penance and Thurible, let's get back to the augment for our first ability, Tribunal. When you equip this, then all the effects of Penance and Thurible, the healing and the energy generation, all that will also be triggered whenever allies attack enemies that are chained by your first ability. If you want to play Harrow as a team support, then I think it is, well, not a must-have, it's definitely not bad, and it solves a little bit of the issues that we previously talked about. However, as a solo player, there is absolutely no point to ever use this. And last but definitely not least, let's talk about his signature move, Covenant. This right here is where the red crits are made. When you press the ability, then you and all allies in affinity range will become briefly fully invulnerable. During this time, all the damage prevented against you and your allies will be summed up for you on screen. After this invulnerability period then ends, you will get the crit buff based on how much total damage was soaked up. The base value of the crit buff is 5% if you didn't take any damage, and it goes all the way up to a maximum of 50%, which, if I calculated it right, would take a total of 3000 damage prevented at 100% ability strength. And yes, this crit buff too is not just for you, but also for every affected player. But now, here is the reason why this crit buff is so ridiculously overpowered. While a maximum of 50% crit might not sound all too impressive at first, there are two factors that we need to consider here. First of all, if you hit an enemy's weak spot, then your crit chance buff is actually multiplied by 4, so with a maximum of 50%, that is plus 200% on a weak spot hit. And secondly, but more importantly, this crit chance buff does not work like a normal point strike mod. It is not multiplicative like most other ones. Instead, this crit chance buff is a flat additive bonus. To make it very simple, what that means is, the game takes whichever final crit chance your weapon has after mods and buffs and everything, and then it just goes and says, plus 200. So yeah, you can probably see why this is pretty strong. And that's exactly the point here. Covenant is already good for weapons that have a high crit chance to begin with, but especially for those few that have high crit damage multiplier combined with low base crit chance, Covenant will just turn them into the most ridiculous overpowered thing since sliced bread. Now, for Covenant, we also have an augment, and this is actually one of my favorites. I would even go so far to say, on many builds, this is a must-have. What Lasting Covenant does is pretty simple. Instead of running out after the ability duration is over, you can infinitely extend the duration of the Covenant buff simply by getting headshot kills. And as always, if you could leave a quick like for the video, that would be very helpful with the YouTube algorithm, so thank you so much for your support. But now that we got a recap on what Harrow can do, let's talk about the builds, and the first one of which would be a easy to put together budget build. This right here would be it, and I don't want to go all too deep into it because I think most of it is pretty self-explanatory. First of all, please excuse that I have Thermal Sunder over my 1. This build actually does not need any Helminth, but I have it in the slot that I usually use for my speed leveling. What we do with the mods here is relatively straightforward. We use whichever aura you want. I just picked Dreamer's Bond as a default, but you can use whatever you like. Then, because Harrow has pretty high base shields, we want to build him into a sort of shield tanking playstyle, which is why I use Redirection. If you wanted to be extra safe though, you could go and also add Vitality, which is nice, because you can heal yourself and all. I don't think though that it is necessary. Flow to increase your maximum energy, and that's really all we need for the energy economy, because with Thurible, we're gonna get so much energy income. There's no equilibrium, no arc energize, no nothing needed. You will never run dry with this. What we do want though is a relatively high duration, which is why I went for continuity as well as augur message. If you have something like, let's say, narrow-minded, then I would recommend definitely use that one too, because duration is really king on Harrow. Makes it much more convenient. However, one thing I do want to say though with low-level builds like this is that especially Covenant, interestingly, needs higher ability strength on lower mission levels. Reason for that is that the soaked up damage that you need to get your crit buff, that scales with ability strength. The higher the strength, the less damage you need to soak up in order to get the maximum crit. So logically, in Steel Path, 1 or 2 hits is already enough to get you over the threshold, whereas in low level, it might be nice to have a bit more strength so that it's easier to max out the crit buff. One thing though that I highly recommend is Lasting Covenant, the augment for the 4 that makes headshots extended forever. And I know, this is a cheap beginner build, and usually I don't use augments on beginner builds because it can be quite a pain to level up your syndicates until you can get them. With this one though, I do make an exception because Lasting Covenant is just so incredibly valuable for Harrow, and you don't even need to level up your syndicates because the Lasting Covenant is part of the Deviri Circuit reward rotation where you can get Harrow and you can snipe this one as well. So it's relatively easy to get. But now that we're done with the cheap and easy build, let's get into Steel Path territory. And as per usual, I first want to go into a couple of Helminth options. First of all though, of course, the standard stuff always goes. Roar if you want a universal faction damage bonus, Zata's Whisper if you want, well, Zata's Whisper, Banshee's Silence to stun acolytes, even though I don't think it's all that necessary on him because he can stun them with his first ability, or Mirage's Eclipse if you want to be more tanky or whatever. I would go so far to say that Harrow doesn't even need a Helminth ability to begin with. His kit is very synergistic, and playing him just like that is totally fine. However, I also have a couple of special mentions, which just so happen to be the Helminth abilities that we're going to use in the builds going forward. The first one of which would be Evade. Invisible Harrow is one of the most fun that I've ever had with him. It's pretty self-explanatory, right? If you're invisible, enemy can't see you, enemy can't hit you, you are more survivable. At the same time though, being invisible also gives you a couple more offensive options, and we're gonna get into those when we talk about the corresponding build. Another ridiculously powerful subzoom would be Tharo Strike. By default, this is already a great armor strip and in general enemy defenses reduction skill, but since we got the Tharo's lethality augment late last year, holy moly, you can now have Harrow the Crit Master with the crit damage buff from this skill as well. Also here, we're gonna have the build later. And then the last honorable mentions would be Pyrotechnics from Temple. This one is a very interesting and super broken interaction that I actually didn't even come up with myself. I saw it in a video from KnightmareFrame recently, but I thought this is so ridiculous, I just have to mention it. However though, when it comes to the Helminth, there is one big question with Harrow, and that would be, well, which skill to subzoom over, right? All of them are great, so what can we throw out? And to that, I can say that, of course, it comes down to personal preference. A lot of players, for example, like to throw out the Chu, because the healing part isn't all that necessary anyway, and fire rate can also be buffed with arcanes. Alternatively, one of my favorites though would be to subzoom over your 3. Yes, I know I said it's one of the best energy regeneration tools in the game, however, if we're being honest, Harrow doesn't really need all that energy income for himself at least. If we have the augment for our 4th ability, that means we only need to cast it once and then never again, so no energy drain from that side. The 2nd ability has pretty high duration if you sacrifice a lot of shields, and the 1st is just freaking cheap. So as long as you have equilibrium or something, you kinda don't even need your 3rd skill. And lastly, if you want to rage bait the community, then leave a comment now saying that you subzoom over your 4. Oh man, I shouldn't have said that. But whoever says Helminth abilities also needs to say Archon Shards. So let's take a look at our options here. What I personally did is I used 3 Tau Forged Blues that increase my maximum energy. This gives us a total of 415 energy on the Prime. It's not crazy high, but it also doesn't have to be, and this way it means I have one more mod slot for the build because I don't need a flow mod. Additionally, I like to give him a little bit of casting speed with either 2 normal ones or if you have a Tau Forged Yellow. The rest though fully comes down to personal preference. If you want to, you could give him a bit more ability duration with red shards, which is always convenient on him. Strength though, I don't think you necessarily need that. Then, if you want to play with secondary weapons, you can go orange shards for more crit chance. If you play with melees, you can go for the purple ones that, give you a lot of crit damage. Or if you want to armor strip, you go for the green ones, or literally anything else that you like. But now, let's look at the first Steel Path build. And this one is the quote-unquote standard boring way to play him, no Helminth subsume, just his standard kit. First of all, also here, please apologize, the Ensnare subsume over my 3. I really ran out of slots to showcase these builds, but this build right here is meant to work with his standard kit, no Helminth subsume. Now, what we focus on here is maximum convenience with a lot of duration to have all our buffs up for a long time. Range is round about 100%, a little bit more so that we can hit enemies with our first ability. And then ability strength is also kinda sort of a dump stat here because we are in Steel Path territory, and as I previously mentioned, this one in Steel Path territory soaks up so much damage, you don't really need all that much strength to max it out. In the Aura, you can use whatever you like. In the Exiles, I don't know why I didn't use the Prime variant. And then for survivability, I went for a shield tanking approach with primed redirection as well as adaptation. However, if you wanted to go for shield gating instead, which as we mentioned is very easy with your first ability, then you can drop adaptation and go in for something like rolling guard. However though, if you go for shield gating, definitely do not use catalyzing shields because your shield income with your first ability is going to be so high that you really want to benefit from the higher shield gating duration given by the higher shield. Rest of the build though is self-explanatory, and if you didn't have the blue Archon Shards for the additional energy, then you would potentially go and drop Intensify or something for primed flow to get more maximum energy. What's more interesting though are these 2 arcane slots right here. I left them open for the time being because there's really a lot of different options that you have. I personally prefer to have one of those arcane slots dedicated to buffing up my Harrow stats, and then the other one to buff up whichever weapon I'm playing with. However though, if you wanted to, you could also use both of them to buff your weapon. It's not like Harrow needs much more power than this. What I'm talking about here would be, for example, Arcane Avenger, gives you even more flat critical chance. This one is specifically great if you play your Harrow in a setup where you're not really able to get those headshots. In that case, you only get 50% crit from this, and that means Arcane Avenger basically doubles your flat crit chance bonus to almost 100%. That's a very strong combination. However, if you already headshot and you get 200% from Covenant, then you kinda sorta don't need it all that much. It's nice, but whatever. One thing that you could also do is, whichever weapon class you play with, go for fire rate. Arcane Velocity for the pistols, Arcane Tempo for the shotguns, and so on and so forth. Also, if you play with a weapon that has high crit chance to begin with, Arcane Hotshot, beautiful, gives another 300%. Yes, please. However though, you could also go for the damage approach instead of fire rate or crit, with Arcane Fury giving more melee damage, Arcane Precision, especially great on secondaries, giving 300% base damage, but also Arcane Rage, 180% for primary weapons, nothing to scoff at. As I said, one of them can be dedicated to buff your weapons. And then the second one, I'm gonna go with a buff for Harrow, but also here, if you like to, you can get a second weapon buff as well. What I like to do here is either to go for something like Mold Augmented to get a bit more strength to buff up the fire rate and reload speed on my Penance, but if you don't want to, you can also very easily go for something like Mold Efficiency, giving you even more duration to have your buffs up for longer, or the relatively new Arcane Concentration, which gives you 60% whopping ability duration. Arcane Ice Storm if you have something to trigger it that will give you strength and duration too. So yeah, as I said, a lot of options that you have here, nothing here is objectively right or wrong. So much for the standard Harrow build. However, With this next one though, we're gonna double, triple, and quadruple down into crit. Let's take a look at the Harrow Strike build. What we do here is use the aforementioned Harrow Strike from Styanax. This one we combine with the Harrow's Lethality Augment, which gives us additional crit damage bonus to affected enemies. That is incredibly strong. That is also why on this Harrow build we go for a lot of ability strength, not because his kit necessarily needs it, but because it increases the critical damage that we gain from Harrow's Lethality. So yeah, also here let's take a quick look at the build, nothing all too different compared to the previous one. Aura is free, I use Growing Power, Excellence is free, I used PSF, and then I went for another shield tanking approach with Redirection and Adaptation. Also here, you could go for shield gating if you like to. However, what is different with this one, because we subsumed over our third ability, that means we don't have energy income by default anymore. That is why I went for Equilibrium, and that should really already do it. If you have a companion, for example like Diriga with Synth Deconstruct, you're gonna get so many health orbs that this is just overall fine. In the Arcanes here, also here you could add some weapon buffing too, but I decided for this build that I want to dedicate both slots for just Harrow. Arcane Concentration here gives us more ability duration, which is very convenient, and Mold Augmented will push us over this beautiful 300% crit damage threshold. Not that you particularly need it, it's just because I like 300, it's a nice number. If you wanted to though, this right here would probably be the one that I would replace with something else to buff my weapons. One more option that I want to talk about before we go on would be to also go for something like Overextended to increase our range so that we can hit more enemies with Harrow Strike. I personally don't think it's all that necessary because standard trash fodder enemies will die instantly anyway, don't even need that for them. I usually reserve this ability for the Tech Rod Baobaos and the big enemies that like to be taken out quickly. And for that, 9 meter is just fine. So yeah, if you want to have the maximum crit performance with your Harrow, then the Harrow's build is the one to go for. However, up next I want to show you my personal favorite Harrow build, and that would be the Invisible Harrow. Let's check it out. What we do right here is, we use the aforementioned Evade from Side 09 as our Helminth Subsume. This one will make us temporarily invisible, and the duration gets extended whenever we get a headshot kill. Kinda sorta sounds like a good synergy with Harrow, you know, headshots is his main thing all the time anyway. Just one thing I should mention here is, I decided to subsume over my first ability because I feel that with the invisibility, we have so much survivability already that I don't necessarily need the constant shield refill. If, however, you really like it, or you want to have it for the crowd control, then it's perfectly okay to also subsume over your third ability instead, and then use something like Equilibrium for your energy sustain, like we did with the Harrow Strike build previously. In the Excellence, you can go for whatever you like, however in the Aura, it kinda sorta depends. If you wanted to go for Arcane Avenger, like I do here, then you're kinda forced to go for Combat Discipline. Reason is, we are invisible, and that means we don't take regular damage, that's why we have to do it ourselves. Also, because we're having this constant heal going on, I decided to go for Archon instead of Umbral Intensify, because this will give us a total of 60% strength versus only 44%. I should say though that if you don't want to use Arcane Avenger, that also means you don't need Combat Discipline, and in that case it would be more efficient to go for Growing Power with Umbral Intensify instead. The rest of the build then focuses on a healthy mix of duration for the overall convenience, as well as strength, because you know that gives us more fire rate, more heal, and all that good stuff. What's more interesting though would be the arcane slots here too. Just like I said with the standard build, you're also pretty free to do whatever you like here. If your weapon of choice benefits from having more flat crit chance, then Arcane Avenger is the way to go. If you have already high base crit chance to work with, you can go for Arcane Hotshot, in which case, you know, you would change all the other mods that were tailor-made for Arcane Avenger, as I just said. And then in the second one, I went for Arcane Crepuscular. This is pretty cool and a perfect synergy with the invisibility, because it gives us 30% more ability strength and a final 3x crit damage multiplier whenever we are invisible. So all the time. However, this is not the only weapon benefit that we get from the invisibility. One thing that is very often overlooked is that if we are invisible, that allows us to use Spectral Serration over Normal Serration on our weapon of choice. This is very amazing because even though it's quote-unquote just base damage, 330 whopping % base damage from one mod? Consider me intrigued. It's very good, and you can only use this if you are invisible. The last build on our list, though, is a build that is literally broken. It is incredibly strong and super fun to play. Let me introduce the NUKE Harrow. As I previously said, this build I didn't come up with myself. I saw the idea in a video from KnightmareFrame earlier, but I did adjust his build a bit to my personal preferences. So let me explain what's going on here. As a Helminth Subsume, we use Pyrotechnics from Temple. The skill creates a 20-meter AoE at the point that you're aiming at, in which enemies will take damage from, well, Pyrotechnics. However, the fun thing with Pyrotechnics is that it is, I would say, a little bit bugged. DE, please don't fix though, it's too much fun. The thing with Pyrotechnics is that even though it is a Warframe ability, it benefits from universal weapon bonuses. Just in case you want to know what's considered a universal weapon bonus by the game, there's a full wiki page on it that lists all the stuff, but for the sake of this video, we're gonna go over it one by one. The main function is that Pyrotechnics benefits from the crit chance bonus of Covenant. And that's right, even though it is a Warframe ability, not a weapon, and it doesn't even have crit chance to begin with, it benefits from Covenant. And that means you will get yellow crits on a body hit, but Pyrotechnics also really likes to headshot, which means you're also going to see a bunch of orange crits. That is very strong. What makes the whole thing even better is that now that we have crits, we can increase the crit damage. Yes, it's not possible to mod the crit damage of any ability, but we can use something like Arcane Crepuscular and all of a sudden we have 3x crit damage on an ability that has no crit chance and no crit damage. Very nice. You might wonder, how do we get invisible? This is something that we're gonna do with the Huras Kubro. That is the equivalent of the Shade Sentinel, and he has the mod Stalk, which will make us invisible whenever we are near enemies. Now, this invisibility will deactivate whenever you shoot a weapon, but given the fact that we are using Pyrotechnics, which is a Warframe ability, this doesn't matter. We will not be uncovered because we are technically not using a weapon. The rest of the Huras Kubro build, by the way, most of this doesn't matter all too much, but I do want to give a shout out to Tenacious Bond, because just like Arcane Crepuscular, this one too gives you another 1.2 times crit damage modifier on top. So our Pyrotechnics are now going to have a crit damage multiplier of 4.2. Going back to our Harrow now, that is the first great synergy that we have. With our invisibility from the Kubro plus our 4, that means we are going to get a whole bunch of crit out of this. One thing I do want to say though is that since we're not using weapons, that makes it a bit difficult to keep our 4 up, but I still decided to go for Lasting Covenant because it's also not that difficult, right? You go out of your invisibility, get a couple headshot kills here and there, and then you have like 80 seconds duration in which you can be invisible and dance around as you like. The second synergy that I want to talk about here though is Arcane Arachne. For most weapons, this is nothing special, but this one too is considered a universal weapon bonus, meaning the plus 150% damage don't only apply to your weapons, but also to Pyrotechnics, which is very, very nice. And lastly, if you wanted to go all out, you could also go into the Naramon Focus School and then use the Lethal Levitation perk, which will give you even more additional damage. That's also universal faction damage. But you know me, I like convenient playstyles, so I decided to not use this one for today's build. Just wanted to mention it. What this means now is, when we start into the mission and charge our 4th ability to get a bit of crit chance, and then we do a wall latch to trigger our Arcane Arachne, then we can just wait to be invisible, which we are now, and once the crit chance is there, we can go and cast Pyrotechnics to get a whole bunch of crits. You see it there, you see the orange crits, you see the yellow crits, it deals a ton of damage. All while we are completely invisible and we basically have infinite energy if we use our 3rd ability, which we're of course gonna do in an ideal case scenario. And if you haven't already, then check out my full Warframe tier list right here. Another massive shout out to Niels V, Demon Lord Zell, Demon Emperor, Emperor Prime, Nox Linux Gaming, Turtlepeer on the Kanio 2, Skyla Bowser, Mihaki, Socrates the Almighty Rat, Leo Morizaki, Shadow Lockhart, Hean Taras, Patrosader, Boomia1, Mr. Games, Zave, Awendai, Zengen, Quax, Henrik5984, Blue Eagle 98, Hearthwield, Everin 8802, Gabriel Tevez, Yako Ivan Gonzalez, Candy Fox 19, and all other generous channel members for your continuous support. We see each other hopefully in the next one, and until then, as always, good loot.